I would call this a busy week if you were a Seattle sports fan. So the Kraken make a few, not massive trades, but they acquire a couple first round picks when they give up Yanni Gord and Oliver Borkstrand. Um, then the news comes out that the Seahawks released Tyler Lockett. About 20 minutes later, it's announced that the Seahawks are, DK Metcalf requests the trade. It then comes out that the Seahawks are very mad that that gets leaked, and I understand it. It should have been Tyler's day. Then today, the Kraken make another trade. They trade a personal favorite, Brandon Tanev, to the Winnipeg Jets. George Kirby is going to open the year on the injured list, so the Mariners get in it. Of course, it's not a transaction for the Mariners. But all of that kind of pales in comparison for what just happened a couple hours ago. And I just so happened to be working an NFL shift for Roto World, and it was probably kismet because the Seattle Seahawks have reportedly traded Geno Smith to the Las Vegas Raiders for a 2025 third round pick. Now, there's been a bunch of which pick do the Seahawks actually get? Multiple sources have confirmed on the old Twitter machine, not my sources. I don't know them at all, but multiple good outlets have confirmed that they are getting the 92nd pick in the draft. The Raiders had 3 second-round picks, or third-round picks, excuse me, I believe, and they are getting the lowest of those picks. Where to start? First of all, I'm stunned. I'm not like completely insane enough to think that this couldn't have happened. You know, when you have the run that the Seahawks have had, for better or for worse, something like this can happen, right? Something like this can happen. Let me pause while I turn off notifications because I've been getting messages like crazy. Okay. So when you go 9-8 and 10-7 and don't make the playoffs in the last couple of years, you can't just say, well, the quarterback, unless he's a real young dude, is so entrenched that this is impossible. But I was pretty darn sure that Geno Smith was going to be the Seahawks quarterback in 2025. I thought the Seahawks might address the quarterback position in the second or third round. Still don't think that the Seahawks will address. We'll get into all of that. But I could have seen it, them drafting the heir apparent. I don't think Sam Howell was the heir apparent, really ever, or at the very least, it became very obvious that he wasn't the heir apparent, or at least it seems like it, based on the reports that we got and then his limited action stinking. Anyway, long story short, I could see the Seahawks making a quarterback move. I didn't think it was going to be this move. I did not think it was going to be this move. And so those of you who follow my work know that I've started writing for Seattle Emerald City Spectrum, a place that covers Seattle sports. I always want to call it Seattle City, but Emerald City Spectrum is so much better of a name than that. Our little group chat has been going ham since the move got announced, and some people are really upset by it, and I understand why. Because this move on its own most certainly does not make the Seahawks better in 2025. You cannot make that argument. You cannot argue that the 92nd pick makes the Seattle Seahawks better than Geno Smith. Geno Smith, if he was going in our draft today, would not be the 92nd pick, right? Now, can it make the Seahawks better? I think so. I don't know so, but I think so. But I understand the people who are upset by this. Number one, we talked about it through every single Seattle Seahawk recap. There are some massive Geno Smith fans. Massive. And some of that has to do with the fact that he was the replacement for a quarterback who a lot of people hated at the end of his tenure. And some of that has to do with the fact that he made really good throws, some really good throws, and helped the Seahawks win a lot of games and came up clutch in some huge moments. Now, you can argue the opposite, and we'll talk about that in a second. But there is no denying that people who loved Geno. And then there are people who hate Geno. There are people who, think he is a mediocre quarterback who is not helping the franchise take steps forward. I sit somewhere in the middle. And it's tough, though, because I want to win. I want to win. The feeling that I had when the Seahawks won the Super Bowl is a feeling that's been matched by very few things in my personal life. And honestly, the feeling of winning the NFC Championship game that year is probably the best sporting moment I've had in my life. There's a few that compete with it. The Super Bowl, for one. The Super Bowl was just so non-competitive that, it's great to watch the highlights and stuff. And there's something about winning a championship. But I've only seen one in my life for a team I root for. The Huskies win over Texas goes way up there. The Huskies wins over Oregon that same season. But long story short, I want to win. And I want to win. Said that a bunch of times. It all. But I'm also not super interested, and this is part of me being a baseball guy, right? We see tanking and we talk about tanking. I don't want to see the Seahawks plummet. It might be what's best for the organization, but I don't want to see that. And at the very least, with Geno Smith at quarterback, I know that the Seahawks are going to be competitive. I know that Geno Smith is good enough to get the Seahawks into competitive range. But let me tell you what I also know. I know Geno Smith isn't good enough to win a Super Bowl. Nope. And, we've seen not elite quarterbacks win the Super Bowl. I would argue that Jalen Hurts is not an elite quarterback. But I would also argue that Jalen Hurts is better than Geno Smith. And a good notch above it. Because of his ability to make plays with his legs. Geno Smith by no means slow. But the quarterbacks who have won Super Bowls, with the exception of one in the recent history, being Nick Foles, are all considerably better than Geno Smith. And you can talk about how, cap room and how it's hard to win with a quarterback who makes a bunch of money and all that stuff, right? But most of the time, it's a really good quarterback. In fact, more than most of the time. And that's an obvious point. But there seems to be this idea that you can't win with an expensive quarterback, or that it's better to have a cheap quarterback. It might be better to have one on a rookie deal, but take a look at Patrick Mahomes, yada, yada, yada. My overall point is that Geno Smith, I don't think, is good enough to win a Super Bowl. And ultimately, that's what we're hoping for. That's the ultimate goal, is to win a Super Bowl. Now, I am not a Ricky Bobby if you ain't first your last guy either, like I just said. There is value in going 10-7. There is value in winning more games than you lose. There is no doubt that I get entertainment value from watching the Seahawks win more often than they lose. And they've done it an awful lot, with a very few exceptions, since the Pete Carroll era. And we'll talk about Pete, of course. But that's why I'm kind of in between on this trade, because I don't know if the Seahawks will assuredly get better. Now, there's a chance, and we might as well just get into it now. There are multiple reports that the Seahawks plan on aggressively pursuing Sam Darnold to be their new quarterback. And it's worth pointing out that with this trade, with the release of Tyler Lockett, with the restructuring of and Wosu's deal and the release of the 4 players before, mainly Draymond Jones, they currently have $62 million in cap room. That is the 7th most of any NFL team. I can't remember the last time the Seahawks had this kind of cap room. It might have been recently, and I'm just not remembering. But I can't remember the last time the Seahawks entered an offseason with this kind of cash to spend. And, there's a couple moves they could make to maybe make it a little bit more, but I think this is pretty much what you see is what you get, right? And so they certainly can afford Sam Darnold, and they can afford Sam Darnold plus some other stuff. I am really torn on how I feel about Sam Darnold being the replacement for Geno Smith, because it's the case of ceiling and floor. I think it's pretty easy to argue that Sam Darnold has a higher ceiling than Geno Smith. It's real easy to just remember the last 2 games of Sam Darnold, and I have concerns about them, no question about it. But take a look at the majority of the season that he put together last year. He was exceptional. He was absolutely a franchise quarterback for the majority of the year. Now, those last 2 games, you can't ignore them. And it's been the thing I've worried about with Sam Darnold since he was at USC, that you can kind of see that sometimes moments get too big for him. I saw it at USC. I certainly saw it over those last 2 games in 2025. We saw it as a rookie with the Jets. I don't think he had a lot of help there. But he's also somebody I see sometimes struggle with pressure. Hello, Seattle Seahawks offensive line. I mean, if you're not concerned about that. And to be fair, any quarterback is going to struggle behind the current version. Addition was right. Why did I change it? Change it? Not used to talking this much. Any quarterback's going to struggle behind that O-line. But a quarterback who really, really has had issue, people talk about the seeing ghosts. And by the way, I just realized that I have the TV on in the background, and that's fine. Apologize. For every advertisement you just heard from Practical Jokers, I apologize. But I can't help but wonder how he would handle this offensive line. And I can't help but wonder how he would play with a wide receiver group that is not great right now. It's, if they can bring back DK Metcalf, if he changes his mind, and maybe this has something to do with why DK Metcalf requested a trade. It's possible. And it's possible the Seahawks chose DK over Geno. I kind of have my doubts, but, it's possible. I wonder how he would do without Metcalf. All due respect to Jackson Smith-Njigba, who those of you who have been paying attention to Mile Wide know I am infatuated with his skill set, and I think he's going to be a superstar. Played like a superstar at times this year, played like a star for the majority of the year. But behind that, it ain't great. It ain't great, especially if you have to trade DK. Now, if you trade DK at this point, I think you're bringing a wide receiver back, but it's a young wide receiver. I've seen talks about maybe Romeo Doubs in a draft pick or Roman Wilson in a draft pick. And it's a good draft for wide receivers in that top 50 range, like somewhere between 20 and 50. I think there's some really good wide receivers. By the way, I'll be doing a bunch of NFL draft stuff in the coming weeks for sure. But I wonder how he would do, because look, he had some good weapons with Minnesota. Maybe the best wide receiver in football. I'd probably put him at number 2 right now behind Jamar Chase. Crazy that they were both at LSU together, by the way. Pretty good football team. He had him. He had Jordan Addison for the majority of the year, who's a strong player. TJ Hawkinson, a really good tight end, and a really good offensive coach, right? Like a really strong Kevin O'Connell, I think, gets this. Didn't look great at the end of the year, but you have to do the whole body of work, right? The whole body of work. You can't just judge him based on those couple of games. I don't know how I feel about Sam Darnold, and I especially don't know how I feel about Sam Darnold, and this is not a this is a different take because this is a salary cap league. For every Mariner fan who's watching this and saying, why are you siding with ownership, blah, blah, blah. No, this is different because this is a cap league. And Sam Darnold's going to cost you a massive amount of money. A massive amount of money. Now, it's probably only going to be for 2 or 3 years, but it's going to take up a lot of your cap room. So you're talking about Sam Darnold being the answer for 3 years. And in the NFL, that's a big window. It's a large, large window. I don't know how I feel about it. Let me just tell you this. This is what Chris Crawford would do. And again, Chris Crawford is often stupid, but give you what I would do. I would not sign Sam Darnold. I would sign Justin Fields to a 1-year deal and see how it goes. I love his athleticism. I love his ability to scramble behind a not great offensive line. To say he's played for some poor offensive lines, by the way, until he got to Pittsburgh. And I thought he played pretty well in Pittsburgh. It wasn't perfect, but I thought he played pretty well. And here's the thing. You give it a year, and if it goes poorly, the 2026 NFL draft has much better quarterback options. Now, I like Shedeur Sanders. I like Cam Ward. I like Jackson Dart. I'm not investing huge picks in them, but I like them. But Arch Manning is a different story. Like, anybody who has watched Arch Manning play, and yes, the sample size is limited. If you know anything about football, you come away super impressed. The size, the athleticism, the arm strength, it's all there. I also think Nico Iamaleava is a good player. I would take both of those guys over the top 2 in this draft. I'd rather have those options because I'm just not convinced that Sam Darnold is a franchise quarterback, and you're going to have to pay him like a franchise quarterback. Let me end it with this. I want to thank Geno Smith, and he'll never watch this, and the Seahawks will never watch this and all that stuff. Geno Smith came into an almost impossible situation, right? Geno Smith entered Seattle as a placeholder for whoever the next quarterback was going to be. And he gave you 3 solid seasons. Okay, yes, he didn't end up getting them to where we want to be, right? He didn't end up taking the Seattle Seahawks to beyond a wild card round loss, and they got their butts kicked in that game. He made some silly throws. He drove me nuts towards the end of this year with maybe a lack of responsibility, but I get the frustration too. I get it. But ultimately, Geno Smith was a really good quarterback who gave the Seahawks a lot more than I think we thought he was. And I hope that doesn't sound patronizing. I had such low expectations for Geno Smith based on what I had seen with him with the Jets and the Giants. And to say he exceeded them is the understatement of understatements. So no, it didn't ultimately get to where we want. But I do think we owe Geno Smith some respect. I do think we should appreciate what he did for the Seattle Seahawks for 3 years. And before that is the backup too. Because he gave it his all. I never have questioned Geno Smith's effort, and I never will. This is a weird day. It's a trade I get. I personally think they probably should have been able to do better than 92nd. But I guess that doesn't really matter that much because Geno Smith wanted to go to Las Vegas. I have no doubt in my mind. And reuniting with Pete Carroll, I'll tell you this much right now. I'm rooting for the Las Vegas Raiders next year. I won't root for them to beat the Seahawks or anything like that. And they don't play. They could match up in the Super Bowl. Don't think that's happening. But I will be rooting for the Las Vegas Raiders, especially if they go and get Tyler Lockett. Especially if they go get him. Because I love Pete. I love Tyler. And while I didn't love Geno, I respect Geno. And I know there's going to be all sides to this. But ultimately, where I come down is it's probably the right move, but that's not a disrespectful thing to Geno. It's just we know what Geno can do, and what Geno can do, I don't think is quite good enough. Hopefully that makes sense. Please hit like, please hit subscribe. Let me know your thoughts on the trade. Crazy. What a bonkers week in Seattle, Washington, and good luck, Geno.